Hello, everybody. And on behalf of the APM Greater Bay Area branch, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar. Today, the title is 3 Design Lessons for the Post-Pandemic City. And I can tell you, sitting here in an empty office in Hong Kong, I'm very much looking forward to the post-pandemic city. Please be aware that this webinar is being recorded and that you are in a listen-only mode. The session will last about 60 minutes, consisting of 30 to 45 minutes of knowledge share, concluding with a Q&A session. Please submit your questions via the questions panel during the webinar, and we'll get to them at the end. Following the webinar, the recording will be uploaded onto our APM YouTube account, and the slides will be published in the SlideShare account, both of which will be listed on the branch community page on the APM website. Please allow about 5 working days for this. This session can also count towards your CPD. Today, we are joined by 2 special speakers, Matthew Gevers, Associate and Chief Urban Designer with Arab in their Hong Kong office. Matthew has over 14 years experience in complex integrated planning and design projects. Joining Matthew is Michael Rogers, Urban Design Manager with Arab, who's also in the Hong Kong office and has managed a range of master planning projects across the world. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to hand this over to Matthew for our presentation today. Matthew?
Thank you very much, Jim, and thank you all for joining this morning or this afternoon if you're from Hong Kong, or morning if you're from UK or Netherlands. Before we start, I think we had a few questions, as you can see on the screen on Mentimeter, to have a bit of a idea on some of the things that we're all thinking about before diving into the sharing session from our side. Can I ask maybe for the first question?
Excellent, thank you. Thank you everyone for getting involved. Please open your mobile phone or another web browser and visit menti.com. And at the top of the screen, you can see the unique code 52050498. And then from there, please get involved. So the first question is linked to the issues facing Hong Kong. What do you see as the most important issue related to urban development facing Hong Kong today? So we're starting to get some results through, which is good to see. So Matthew and Michael, just to confirm, you can see the results coming in okay?
Yep, perfect. It's nice to see the answers and those differences actually between the 3 as well.
Perfect.
I think it's definitely something that we'll talk about each of the different topics you see on the screen here. I'm happy to see that we're split between those 3 topics, and that they relate to each other as well.
Excellent, thank you. I'll move on to the next question. So this is about the outlook. Do you think there will be a permanent change to the way we design our cities? So we're starting to get some results through. I'm sure if someone answered D, they have no idea. They'll learn something through this presentation to gain some knowledge. But we can see that B and C are clearly winning through.
Yeah, fantastic. It's good to see that there is an opportunity for change, let's say. And I think that's some of the aspects that we would like to talk about today, either in the short term, let's say a small permanent change, or significant systematic changes coming out of this. And I think that's something we would like to discuss as well today. Thank you, Rob. I'm okay to go to the presentation. Thank you all. Thanks for joining this morning and afternoon. We would like to share our thoughts and our thinkings that are not only ours, but also part of Arab's view towards how to deal with similar kind of questions. And it's titled 3 Design Lessons for a Post-Pandemic City, something that I hope we are going towards post-pandemic. Hong Kong, of course, is going through another wave at the moment with significant disruptions. Whereas I see other parts of the world are moving towards opening up slowly. So there are different stages in which we're all across the world, and it's quite interesting to think about that. How does that relate? How do those other parts of the world relate to our own way of thinking about our cities? Next slide, please. And I think we're all quite familiar with what has happened in the last 2 years, and perhaps what we are dealing still with in case of, in this case, Hong Kong, for instance, about significant disruptions in supply chain, in the way we live, the way we interact with our cities, and the fact that something that was deemed quite let's say, not possible to be disrupted, had to change our mindset, and we suddenly are faced with a city that can be closed, for instance. Next slide, please. And that's not the first time, actually. This is a graph, although with small letters, but this is a graph from New York, which sets out the different epidemics and pandemics across the last 2 to 2.5 years, where you see different spikes of deaths per ratio of population. But what is very interesting, actually, is that after each of these events, significant step changes have been brought forward in the way we think about our city, the governance of our city. And one of the major things, you see the 2 spikes here in around 1840, 1860, those were 2 cholera spikes, is that actually, in this case, the Board of Health, for instance, has been established at exactly that point in time. So you see that those forced disruptions actually allow for changes in the way we deal with our city and the way we think about our city. Next slide, please. And one of the things that of course is quite different nowadays than thinking about those 200 something years ago, is that since the beginning we're all quite familiar with this kind of images. Although this is an outdated image, of course, but the awareness of having information about what's happening around us has significantly changed. And the question, of course, is can that help us to think differently about the way we deal with our cities? Can that awareness and the fact that we have information at this point on what is happening within our cities and what is happening with the people within living in those cities, can that help us to think differently about the way we plan our cities? Next slide, please. And I think one of the key things that is quite important here is, yes, of course, cities have sometimes higher absolute numbers, but it is also because more people live in cities. And this is a simple graph from the UN, if I'm not mistaken, which highlights the benefits that cities have. And this is something that I think we all want to stress in the presentation today, is that there are significant benefits, even though we have to deal with situations that we're in now, for instance, in terms of benefits of dealing with our city. Next slide, please. So we've split our sharing into 3 sessions. The first session by Michael is about digital transformation. The second and the third, I will come back and I will highlight some thoughts about design should work for everyone and design for change. I think actually 3 key elements that drive the way that we are and should be thinking more about our cities. To you, Michael.
Yes, thanks, Matt. Next slide. So as Matt just mentioned, I guess a digital skeleton is really essential in building up the necessary infrastructures to support citywide digital transformation. I guess the pandemic has really proved the need for real-time, geolocated, publicly available information, and that's for all sectors, for all health, sanitation, transport, supply chains, etc. We can't keep thinking of these in isolation anymore. Next slide. But digital skeletons can also come in many other forms. Historically, when we think about cities and the urbanization of cities, we think about things becoming more dense and more people. So people having to interact with, share, occupy various different activities within that same space. So what I want to talk about today is one of those tools or skeletons that Arup utilizes, and we've adapted it to start to answer a very, very different operational question. Next slide. So with that in mind, this is a brief introduction or brief animation into a piece of software called Mass Motion. It's used across the built environment to look at sorts of design questions. How do we get people to move efficiently through space? How do we move people in sufficient numbers? And how do we make sure that designing spaces with people in mind will be utilized in the future? Next slide. So with the current situation, if we have to use spaces such as museums and airports in wholly different ways, the design challenge isn't necessarily anymore about how do we move people through, or move as many people through spaces. It's more about how do we respond and reshape these spaces to improve safety. And in particular, our return to life or work life, essentially. More recently, as organizations are looking to return to safe operational capacity, Arup's been optimizing this mass motion software to provide insights to help clients chart a safe path back to normal operations. And when we think about addressing this challenge, in particular return to civic life, how do we reopen sporting and cultural facilities, for example? How do we reopen offices in a safe way? In a commercial sense, Arup has used this software in the London and Hong Kong offices. And what's also an acceptable number of population to return to the office? And testing it from a human movement perspective. The second tool I just want to present to you today is Arup Neuron. It's a centralized analytic platform, which in the future will allow buildings to think on its own, to respond to the environment and the users within that building. Building automation and management obviously has been around for some time, but they mainly focus on the monitoring. So if anything goes wrong, it will come up and say something. But what if essentially AI and IoT platforms can converge to create one network, which would learn and mitigate potential irregularities within that building, such as air quality, for example. The insights from various platforms, not limited, the various platforms within the Arup Neuron, it's not limited to individual buildings. So asset owners essentially can monitor and control and compare performance across a whole campus, for example, or a city block. So with Neuron City, we're currently working with infrastructure authorities in Hong Kong to bring that same level of insight and control to entire city networks. One of these platforms, Neuron Health, there's been a sort of test case within one building, One Taikoo Place in Hong Kong. And it's really a pilot application set up in the main lobby with a monitoring and notification system. So essentially to build people's trust, to get people back to the workspace. And also it is a mitigating device. So essentially it's connecting both the reading of the air quality with an air purification system and detecting whether or not COVID is in the lobby or not. So circling back to that need for citywide digital transformation strategies, we must embrace that all these public services are thought of in an interconnected way. These matters because our cities and infrastructure are really becoming more virtual with greater capacity and reliability. So these networks will respond better and faster in the future. In particular, with disaster responses such as outbreaks of the flu or any other type of pandemic. So what is crucial from our perspective also is the changing socioeconomic needs of our cities, and that's what we will talk about in the next part of the presentation. So I'll pass it over to Matt.
Thanks, Michael. One of the key things is what we've seen is that some parts of the population actually have been harder hit than other parts. And it's something that we should acknowledge. It's something that may also need tailoring to specific parts of the world where different groups of the community have different opportunities. And I would highlight one specific group in particular that became at the forefront during this last 2 years that we've gone through. Next slide, please. And it's coming out of the fact that one of the key trends, of course, that we are dealing with is the fact that we're rapidly urbanizing across the world. And that means that by 2050, the key urbanization in the world is expected to increase to about 70%, which is a drastic step change in the way we need to think about cities. Next slide, please. And simultaneously, while we're rapidly urbanizing, we're also rapidly aging. At a global scale, we've surpassed in 2017 the rate between growth of an older part of the population, in this case 65 plus, versus a younger part of the population, which means that as a world, we are aging. Next slide, please. But what is quite interesting is that what you have seen in the last 6-7 decades happening in Europe, a significant step change in the aging of the population over a period of, let's say, 60-70 years is about to happen, is starting to happen now in Asia. But key here is that the absolute number will be larger. The increase will be higher than in compared to Europe, and the time frame in which that will happen will be quicker. So we're talking here about 30 to 35 years, where that same group of people actually ages to a significant portion of elderly in the population. Next slide, please. And Hong Kong plays actually quite an important role in that. By 2050, about 1/3 of the population will be over 65 years old. And that requires a very different way of thinking how we deal with the city, especially in cities that are denser and taller, where we live in buildings of 20, 30, 40 stories, as here in Hong Kong. And for instance, impairments of elderly population. But also thinking about how that relates to health, how to ensure that different groups in the population can allow sufficient, let's say, exercise or sufficient health improvements in their daily lives. Next slide, please. As prevention is one of the key aspects in dealing with health in the city. Thinking, for instance, about the benefits of walking during daily activities, especially for that elder population. Think about the role that we have been thinking about green structure in the city, about our parks, about our, in Hong Kong, for instance, the relevance of our sitting out areas, but also in linear structures such as waterfronts, etc. And that requires us to think differently in the future on equality in relation to access to these infrastructures, making sure that different age groups, but also groups with different ethnicities have similar access to such infrastructure, which is not always as easy as it likes. And the benefits are great. Criminality goes down on average, mental health and physical health drastically increases. And of course, also value of, for instance, adjacent properties increases significantly. So it is quite important to think about green infrastructure as part of the way we think about the future of our city. And it helps us to think more about how do we deal with walking in our cities. Higher density cities might get squeezed into efficient transport means. We see in Hong Kong the dominance of public transport, but also the occupation of car-based transport at the ground level, pushing pedestrians to the first floor and the basement, the first basement floor, which increases safety, but also requires us to think of the value of walking and the aspects related to walking, especially for groups of our society that are not doing that as a commute or in a purpose to go from point A to B. Think about elderly that go for a very small stroll, for instance, through the neighborhood park on a day-to-day basis. And that is quite important to think about each of those aspects in relation to densified cities. It allows us also, when we think about walkability, to think differently about our streetscapes. I think we all seen images of potential changes to our streetscapes, discussions about lanes of roads being transformed into cycling tracks to allow different forms of commuting, because going by bus is less desirable in a pandemic situation, etc. But there are more systematic changes as well in thinking about walkability. Think about efficiency and of using our streetscapes and the value of our streetscapes and the way we use them as well. And that can allow us also to think of how do we deal with stacking different infrastructures and creating a healthy living environment. This is a model that is relatively common in Hong Kong, where we see a lot of rail plus property development, combining both either at grade or underground rail with a new ground floor on top, a public transport interchange encased in a podium with retail facilities and other community facilities, and a walkable environment on top. And although this might have other problems in terms of accessibility to and from such places, it does allow us to think differently about the way we perceive our ground floor in the city. And this is quite important to, as designers, to work with this, to ensure that as, let's say, influencers in the way we think about our city, that we're not taking a passive approach, but that we work together with our, let's say, city governors in the way we think about our cities. We challenge the way we allow positive change to happen within the decision framework that our city governors have. Next slide, please. And especially if we think about elderly population, our planning guidelines or our planning horizons that we often deal with may take years to be actually materialized, thinking about planning horizons of 20, 30 years ahead, which is quite common. But that means that 20, 30 years ahead, we're already in 2050. And that means that if we then need to think about the need that our elderly population has, means that we need to design for such changes now and not wait until later stages. And thinking about those changes is actually bringing us to the next topic. Thinking about how can we adapt to especially uncertainty. We have now gone through a series of disruptions that are related to the current pandemic. It might be similar in the next pandemic. We might get lessons learned that we can apply to improving the resilience of our city systems. But it might also be in a different form. We've been focused primarily on airborne transition and the dangers that come from airborne transitions, but other diseases have manifested itself through other means, for instance. So that requires us to think strategically and in a flexible way about our urban systems. Next slide, please. And those changes are quick, especially in the Asian context. This is 30 years ago, Shanghai, Pudong site, across the river, which was an area newly to be developed at that time. And next slide, please. Only 30 years later, actually less in this picture, 20 years later, you see the drastic change that the urban environment has gone through only in a period of 20 years, which means our planning horizon and the way we deal with that actually plays a very important role in thinking about the risks that we need to mitigate in the future. Next slide, please. And that's not only directly on buildings and streetscapes, etc., but more rapid changes have even bigger consequences as well. This is a picture of the inauguration of Pope Benedictus in 2005 in Rome. Next slide. Where you see a dramatic change between the inauguration of Pope Francis in just about 10 years later. Technology has made an incredible step change in changing our daily lives. And in that period of only about 10 years, changes are significant in the way we have harnessed technologies. And this almost is a kind of detachment from the time frames that we're dealing with when we think about planning for urban areas or when we think about the future of cities that are often talking about 20, 30, 40, 50 years ahead. So think about the type of changes that can happen in terms of technology as well. Next slide, please. And that also applies to digital, of course. Same kind of concept. A change in 10 years is a drastic change in the way we deal with data. What we now think as big data may be easier to manage in a relatively short time, whereas a new threshold of big data actually will become apparent in how we can deal with those large amount of information that will come out in the coming years, dealing with IoT, dealing with other digital data sources that allow us to rethink the way we respond to cities. It gives us also flexibility in the way we answer to managing our cities. It also requires us, but this is a different time frame, to think differently about the way we work. Our less rosy picture of how our workplace used to be. And next slide. Of course, a trend that we have to deal with, a trend that changes the way we educate ourselves, the way we allow ourselves to engage with our working environment. And that might need a skill set change, that might need a different way of thinking about daily works on all aspects and all levels of society as well. Next slide. And this requires us to think, next click please, to think, and this is not a dirty word, but it allows us to think differently about the way we deal with volatility in urban environments, uncertainty, things that we cannot yet predict, but still need to think how we can prepare ourselves for it. Complexity and ever more complex urban environment, more information that we need to respond to, giving us the opportunity to respond more accurately and better, but also requires us to think more holistically about the way we deal with information. And of course, ambiguity in the way we shape our cities. A typical example of simple separation between work and living that was coming out of the industrialization age directly as a means to improve the actually health of residents within the city might require us now to think differently about the way we separate work and living in our city. digital as well as geolocation plays actually a very important role in that aspect. It is a very powerful tool that allows us to respond quicker and allow decision makers to have more insight in responding to sudden situations or sudden changes in our city. Real-time geolocation actually would enable the tracing of people's movement and the anticipation of, for instance, the prevention of crowd or mass gathering in relation to, for instance, things that we saw in recent 2 years. Healthcare is another very let's say, ready for change side of our city, an industry that has undergone significant changes in the last decades, but can harness a lot of potential for using digital technologies in the way we deal with our healthcare, allowing both ensuring safety in situations that we don't want to go out of our house while still receiving healthcare, but also improving the quality of the healthcare that we actually get. And I would say it more like this key disruptions that we've gone through are new opportunities to think about our city rather than constraints that we need to apply to our city's thinking. It's not a city of 1.5 meter distance. It's a city that allows us to cycle. It's this kind of mindset change that will allow us to think of solutions on how to systematically change our cities. And that resilience actually is one of the key drivers in the way we at Arab look at cities. We've worked with several institutes, of which, for instance, one is the Rockefeller Institute, Rockefeller Foundations, on setting up frameworks on how to analyze and respond in terms of resilience within cities. This is an example of the city resilience framework you see here. Next slide, please. It also requires us to think on the way forward. We're living in a world that is becoming increasingly complex and uncertain. Think of climate change, think of biodiversity loss and resource scarcity issues that might happen future generations. We've set up a series of scenarios helping to start discussions on trying to figure out the right way forward. As every part of thinking about our cities, of course, is always a trade-off. Next slide, please. And one of the frameworks that we've set up is a framework called the 2050 scenarios for plausible futures, visions of the world in 2050. Some more rosy, some less rosy, but they help to identify what is the key drivers that we're trying to strive for and which are the key elements that we should aim to avoid. And this is a cross-shaped diagram, a framework that sets out planetary health versus human health. If we look at it from the current situation and the way we are currently dealing with our world, where we're not taking sufficient care of both the human conditions as well as the planetary health. It's what we've called the Extinction Express, and it's ripe for change. Next slide, please. Otherwise, we would move towards an environment where we have to deal with social unrest, where we have to deal with changing climatic conditions and, of course, also supply chain disruptions. On the other hand, if we would focus on solving some of the human needs, but not enough on the planetary needs, we come to a scenario that we've called Humans, Inc. It is quite similar to our current trajectory. A world that is changing, which we're solving societal conditions, but sometimes at the cost of planetary health. We see this happening across the world. This is a situation that would require a step change before we could think in the long-term future as well. This trajectory that we have would cost, especially on the planetary side, giving us less space to thrive in, thinking about our cities as islands of isolation outside of our natural environments. The third quadrant actually looks at what if we focus on the planet itself? What if we look at improving planetary health? We could do that by changing our focus from people-oriented toward planet-oriented. It will create a better environment in which we live, but in the same time, it will severely restrict the way we have our living conditions. It will create conflicting situations and needs a strong hand to make sure that we don't misuse our natural environment surrounding us. If we put the Earth system as a priority and we would adhere to that, we can achieve some desirable situations, but our living situations might deteriorate significantly. That means, and of course, this is a conclusion that we are all aware of, but it's important to be aware of when we do our work, either as designer or as manager. Thinking about the so-called the post-Anthropocene, where we ensure that both planetary health and the human conditions actually improve, making sure that through the works that we're doing, we're actually delivering that higher quality of living environment. Next slide, please. Establishing a new harmony, both within our cities and outside of our cities. A harmony between living and nature as well. The way we look at and use the resources we have surrounding us in relation to the way we use our cities as well. And this comes back to the question on change, designing for change. Change, it will always be there. The change will always be eventful, and the right path to that post-Anthropocene world will not be an easy one. And it will be full of conflicting agendas, undesirable events, and several obstacles along the road. As long as we strive for that specific goal, the journey will be complex, but the future and the change that it will bring us actually starts with us today. The next slide, please. And this is almost the end of the sharing from our side. And this brings it back to, I think, who are we designing for? And this is, of course, the city of our children, the city of our grandchildren as well. And those cities will still be cities. Those cities will even perhaps be more city than we think they are now. There'll be new levels of density, new levels of interaction, and new levels of us dealing with our cities' resources, our cities' infrastructures. And the cities have always and probably will offer such a attractiveness to much of the population to live in those cities, not only from practical means such as job opportunities, but also in the opportunities that the city brings in terms of interaction, social integration, exposure to different cultures, things like our high street retail that we have, our sustainability around public transport, etc. So this, even dealing with the pandemic, requires us to think in the way we deal with our city in a positive manner rather than a constraining manner. Decades of work have gone into setting the right guidelines, and the right advocacy has gone into, let's say, persuading designers and planners and policymakers about the benefits of living in an urban environment. And with the pandemic, that might have gotten a shock or a wake-up call to rethink the way we deal with our cities. But what matters most is that we ensure that those benefits, those social interactions, will always remain available in our cities. And I think that's our last slide for today. Hope to answer any questions you might have.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Matthew. We've had a lot of great comments coming through during the presentation, so thank you for your time. And what I'm going to do is just delve straight into the questions, if I may. So Jimmy has said, do you expect more distributed generators such as rooftop solar panels happening in the future and changing the city design?
Thanks for the question. Good question. We often talk about decentralization of infrastructures in the city as one of the ways to increase resilience. Downscaling some of the energy provision to either neighborhood level or building level might play a role in supporting that. Yes, that could be through means of solar panel. That could also be through other means. As you could see from, for instance, the pictures on the Pope Benedictus, such technological change might happen quite quickly and might change also quite quickly. And perhaps, yes, solar is one of the most positive ways we can think about energy provision at this point. But let's say in 1 or 2 decades, we might also think of other means of energy provision that play an important role in our city.
Excellent, thank you. And Jimmy, thank you for the question. Mark has asked, have you been approached to put real-time sewage monitors in place for COVID? Sample tests in Hong Kong might be days or weeks too late.
Not that I know of. Matt, are you familiar with the monitoring
real time?
device?
I don't know in Hong Kong. I know in other countries there is some real-time monitoring. I think in Hong Kong it's I'm not sure, but I think it's not real-time monitoring. It's incidental probing. Of course, it gives a good insight. It gives us more understanding on what might be happening in which part of the city, and if there are ways to control that. Think, for instance, on neighborhood lockdowns, these kind of things.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I think with Arab Neuron, the tool that I previously talked about, that's more to do with the building management. So it's sort of energy management, chiller plant optimization, air side optimization. So yeah, it doesn't actually take into account any of that sort of sewage treatment stuff.
Excellent, thank you. Alex has just posted a statement and a question worked into that. So it says, thank you for the fantastic presentation. The cross-sectional image of the multi-level road with a pedestrian surface on top is fascinating. Barring a few subsurface transport links, namely the London Underground in the UK, I'm not aware of any large-scale projects where this is happening. Do you envisage more multi-level roads within UK cities going forward?
Thanks. A really good question. It's something that, of course, across Europe, we're also discussing. It's something that in Hong Kong is relatively common because the way that that land is being administered within Hong Kong, but also the fact that the MTR, the Mass Transit Railway Corporation in Hong Kong, also plays a role as a lead developer for some of the station areas on top of their railway stations. They do that by partnering up with developers in the city to develop, for instance, residential or commercial uses on top of their railway stations. Land administration plays a key role in that. Might be different from country to country. I know in the UK, Europe has been heavily involved in King's Cross, I think, in a more horizontal form of transport-related and development opportunities. It also has to deal with, of course, the lack of land availability in Hong Kong, which drives up land value and therefore has a inherent driver to stacking elements on top of each other. just because of the terrain and the topography in Hong Kong and the way that land is being administered. I do think that more compactness also in European and cities in let's say in the western parts of the world will go through a change of densification. It might bring opportunities for vertical stacking. It will bring also other challenges, right? So how do you connect to other parts of the city when you raise your floor level, especially in an area of the city that is relatively flat? But those can be mitigated. It gives pros and cons, I think.
Excellent. Thank you, Matthew. And Alex, thank you for the question. Wouter has asked, is densification reducing poverty or high density areas not affordable for the less owning?
It's a good question. It's something that, for instance, Hong Kong struggles with because of high land value and the effort that the government needs to put into ensuring that, let's say, less affluent parts of the society will have similar access to facilities or infrastructures than other people. And the way that government actually deals with that land allocation is becoming increasingly more complex with an increasing density. I understand fully what you mean with your question. Thanks, it's a really good question. Hong Kong does have the opportunity to work with that in its own solution. Hong Kong's land is fully owned by the government, except for small pieces, small parts, and leases it out to future developers for a period of time, which allows it to retain control over its territory and also control the developments that are happening on top of it. And through that means aim to reduce inequality between in the population.
I guess from my perspective, coming from Australia, when governments see the opportunity to densify, it's a cost-saving device for both the government and for residents, because you're sharing facilities, you're sharing services. So if you're close to the train station or you're close to a supermarket, you don't need a car, you don't have to drive to the supermarket because your supermarket is within walking distance. So there is I guess a cost-saving element to it. It does depend on the location, as Matt's mentioning. Yeah, so that's, I guess, my input as well.
So thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Michael, and thank you for the question. Mark, and I suppose this follows on similar to what you were saying, Michael, in your last answer. Do you agree, or I'll expand, have any thoughts with the Paris 15-minute city ambitions?
Do you want to try that, Matt?
Yeah, sure, no problem. Thanks for that. Really good question. It's interesting because 15-minute cities, of course, is something that is used a lot in the last couple of years in the way we think about cities. Whether it is 15, 20, 5, 1, or however amount of minutes, I think the objective actually is to ensure that within a certain radius, several facilities will become available for people at a certain distance, which is always a good thing, of course, to think about that. If I look at it from the Hong Kong perspective, this is slightly different because Hong Kong is based upon a TOD model where metro stations form the centers of new towns and new districts already since the beginning. Hong Kong is set up especially like that, often with a walkable radius of, let's say, 15 to 20 to 25 minutes to reach the outskirts of a district or a neighborhood. What you see, for instance, in Hong Kong is that some of the landscaped areas, not the parks, but really the hillsides and the ridge lines and the country parks are often really close to where people live, and very accessible through that means as well. Although, on the other hand, of course, it creates a very extreme form of urban transect between, let's say, rural areas and urban areas that are highly dense versus almost unbuilt country parks. The TOD model in itself is another interpretation of that 15-minute city, having around the metro station different facilities. So each neighborhood around each metro station often has a community center, has its own health clinic, etc., etc. A wide range of different facilities. So in that sense, the 15-minute city is almost the same in Hong Kong as the TOD model. But if we look at other cities, think of Shanghai, for instance, or think of European cities that are often more in a horizontal form of development, they benefit strongly from looking at the way we administer our cities, the way we do our zoning, in organizing in that such a way that we maximize accessibility for residents of the city. Thanks for the good question.
Excellent, thank you. I'll finish on this final question, and what I should point out is there's some great comments coming through on Menti, so thank you everyone for posting those. Michael, Matthew, I promise it's not me posting them in the background, it's actually the audience members. So thank you everyone. I'm going to finish on Josie's question, who says, do you foresee Hong Kong experimenting with waste to energy systems in the near future?
Yeah, good question. I think both of us are not very familiar with waste systems and the intricacies about dealing with waste in Hong Kong. I think some of the topics that I've encountered, and maybe Michael, you can see if you have different topics on that as well, is the way we deal with separation of waste in the city, to be able for it to be used in the process of waste to energy. There is, of course, opportunity, but it would require a change also in other urban systems. It's not the plant itself that is the key problem to be built. It is the systems of waste collection and waste organization and waste management that would require an overhaul to be able to enable that waste to energy transition.
There's actually the T Park, which is Hong Kong's first waste to energy plant, which opened just recently, and that's an Arab project. So we're very committed to this becoming more popular and more mainstream in Hong Kong. But it is, I think, as Matt mentioned, it's quite a new technology, I think, even for Hong Kong. And it does come down to how we can source the sludge and how do we treat that in a way. But I guess we're not the experts in this regard. But yeah, it's an interesting topic to look into.
Excellent. Thank you both, and thank you again for the question. I'm going to welcome Jim back to bring today's event to a close, but I personally would just like to say thank you to you both for giving up your time with the presentation and the Q&A. But Jim, over to you.
Thank you very much. And before we jump off of that, we do have in Hong Kong a landfill gas project where we produce energy out of the landfill gas. And the Hong Kong government is also currently in construction on the integrated waste management facility, which is on a new reclaimed island, which will also produce some energy from waste. So there are small scale efforts going forward, and I know there's more efforts to increase that in the future. I'd like to echo Rob's comments and thank Matthew and Michael for a very interesting and inspiring talk today, and thank everybody online for joining us. And with that, we'll sign off. Matthew, Michael, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks a lot.